Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable life and reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the red-haired titan of Tudor England who turned being unmarried and outnumbered into something that somehow made being a virgin queen sound less like a choice and more like a threat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Elizabeth Tudor's life didn't start with a lullaby. It started with an execution. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, the human equivalent of a walking midlife crisis, Elizabeth entered the world as a royal heir and was demoted faster than a disgraced court jester. Her mother, Anne, was executed on charges of adultery, incest and witchcraft. Or as historians now call it, Henry got bored. Elizabeth was 2 when her mum lost her head, literally, and as a finishing touch, Parliament officially declared Elizabeth illegitimate. That's right. Toddler Elizabeth went from princess to political inconvenience with the stroke of a quill. It's the today version of getting cancelled before you've learned to read. She was swiftly removed from court and packed off to the countryside like a bad PR campaign. Her household staff was downsized, her allowance cut, and she was politely ignored by most of the court, unless they needed a reminder of how not to marry. One day, she was your Grace. The next, just that red-haired kid with the beheaded mom. But here's where Elizabeth broke the mould. Most people in her situation would have grown up bitter, anxious, or writing moody poetry. Elizabeth. She studied hard Latin, Greek, French, philosophy, theology, and basically everything except how to trust people. She became fluent in 5 languages and emotionally fluent in none. By the age of 9, she'd adopted her personal motto, video, I see and say nothing, which, if you think about it, is a pretty bleak vibe for a 3rd grader, but it was smart. She was playing the long game, blending into the royal wallpaper while quietly clocking everyone who might someday need a poetic form of revenge. She watched the revolving door of Henry's wives and learned 2 things. 1, don't get attached, and 2, never rely on a man with a sceptre and unresolved trauma. While others were trying to stay in the king's good graces, Elizabeth was busy developing a superpower, emotional detachment in a hostile political environment. She weaponized observation like most kids weaponize sarcasm. Being a royal child sounds glamorous, unless of course you were Elizabeth Tudor, in which case it was less glittering destiny and more medieval Hunger Games, but with extra Latin and emotional damage. After being declared illegitimate, Elizabeth was raised with just enough dignity to avoid scandal, and just enough neglect to know she wasn't really wanted. Her education was top tier. She had world-class tutors in languages, classics and philosophy, but the real curriculum was learning how to survive a royal family that made soap operas look restrained. Her half-siblings were walking cautionary tales. Mary, the older half-sister, had a Catholic chip on her shoulder the size of a cathedral. Edward, her younger half-brother, was Protestant, dying, and surrounded by nobles who treated the crown like a pass-the-parcel game with blood involved. Elizabeth wisely kept her opinions to herself and her daggers metaphorical. She mastered the fine art of non-committal nodding. When Protestant reformers visited, she appeared devout. When Catholic traditionalists arrived, she nodded solemnly. No matter who was in power, she was just the quietly brilliant girl in the corner translating Cicero, and definitely not plotting anything, probably. And then there were the stepmothers. So many stepmothers. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, was actually decent to her. She supported Elizabeth's education, and even gave her a taste of something resembling maternal affection. Unfortunately, Catherine then married Thomas Seymour after Henry's death, and things got awkward. Seymour, who was approximately 50% ambition and 50% walking HR violation, got a little too familiar with teenage Elizabeth, waking her up early, tickling her, and chasing her around the garden. Yes, that happened. And no, it wasn't normal back then either. The scandal was swiftly covered up, but the message was clear. Elizabeth was a political target, a potential porn star, and a liability with good cheekbones. She left Catherine's household with her reputation intact and a clear understanding of one thing: trust no one, especially men who smile too much. By her teens, Elizabeth had seen enough betrayal, scheming, and near execution to qualify as a TUDA war veteran. But instead of being traumatized into submission, she simply became better at hiding her reactions. Because in the TUDA world, survival wasn't about strength, it was about strategy, and Elizabeth was already winning. In 1554, Elizabeth got an unexpected invitation from her half-sister Mary, Queen of England and devout Catholic. The occasion was a charming little event called Possible Treason and Imprisonment. Mary was dealing with a Protestant rebellion known as Wyatt's Rebellion. The rebels claimed they were fighting against Mary's upcoming marriage to Philip of Spain, not for Elizabeth. But let's just say Elizabeth's name kept accidentally popping up in conversations. You know, the usual "she probably knew something" vibes that get people locked up in castles. So Mary had her younger sister hauled to the Tower of London, the place where royals either waited to be executed or miraculously redeemed. Elizabeth, in her early 20s, rode through the Traitors' Gate on a rainy March day, likely wondering if this was the world's worst family reunion. But here's where it gets very Elizabeth. Instead of panicking, she calmly stated that she was innocent and asked politely but firmly not to die. She even carved her name into a wall in the tower, because why not leave your autograph at the scene of your almost death? She also refused to be broken. When guards accidentally left her in damp rooms or tried to scare her into confessing, Elizabeth stayed composed. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She didn't even dramatically faint, which frankly was expected behaviour for noble women back then. Mary, to her credit, couldn't find enough evidence to execute her, which is always a nice legal threshold. So after a couple months, Elizabeth was released. Kind of. She was transferred to house arrest in the countryside, where she was still under watch, but now with slightly better window views and fewer rats. What Elizabeth learned during this whole ordeal. Trust no family member who runs a monarchy. Never assume innocence will save you, and always keep a change of dry clothes nearby, just in case the tower is in your weekend plans. This experience could have broken her. It could have turned her bitter, paranoid, or fanatically devout. Instead, she became sharper, quieter, and more calculating. She walked into the tower a potential victim. She walked out a future queen with a mental checklist titled, "People who tried me will be handled later." When Queen Mary died in 1558, most of Europe expected chaos. England had burned Protestants, flirted with Spain, and hovered dangerously close to civil war. The country was broke, anxious, and surrounded by enemies. kind of like a tutor group chat gone very wrong, and then up stepped Elizabeth. She wasn't the obvious choice. Half the court remembered her as the redhead with the tower record, and others assumed she'd be quietly removed or married off to a cousin with a country estate. But when Mary died childless, the Crown didn't have many options, and Elizabeth didn't wait for an invitation. She rode into London to cheers. Cheers that sounded a lot like National Relief. No more burnings, no more Spanish wedding drama. And finally, someone who could read Latin and smile without causing a rebellion. Her coronation in January 1559 was, to put it mildly, a logistical nightmare. London's streets were frozen, the route was chaotic, and the nobles weren't sure whether to treat her like a queen or a very clever political boomerang. But Elizabeth didn't care. She stood in front of the nation wearing a dress of golden white, basically screaming, "Surprise! I lived!" She made it clear from day one. This wasn't going to be a reign of apologies. She wasn't going to roll over for the Catholic Church. She wasn't going to marry just to make Spain happy, and she definitely wasn't going to let her advisors run the country while she smiled and waved. Instead, she gave the kind of speech that made old bishops shift uncomfortably in their seats. She promised justice, stability, and unity, and somehow managed to say all of that without confirming her religious allegiance, her marriage plans, or her policy ideas. It was political vagueness with a crown on top, but it worked because Elizabeth didn't need to be specific. She just needed to show that she wasn't her sister, and that she could survive and thrive in a world that had tried very hard to erase her. By the end of her coronation day, one thing was crystal clear. England hadn't just gotten a new queen, it had gotten a woman who knew exactly what power looked like, and had every intention of keeping it. The second Elizabeth became queen, the marriage offers came flooding in like pigeons to a bread fight. France, Spain, Sweden, and even her own courtiers all started suggesting eligible suitors. Tall ones, Catholic ones, ones with questionable beards, but very attractive territories. Because in the 16th century, a woman ruling alone wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. A single queen. What if she had opinions? What if she made laws while menstruating? What if she didn't immediately hand the keys to her kingdom over to some bearded duke with a good wine cellar? But Elizabeth had a secret weapon. She had no intention of marrying. She knew the second she picked her husband, she'd become queen consort of whoever instead of the actual monarch of England. And that just wasn't going to fly. She'd spent her entire life surviving royal instability. She wasn't about to hand power over to the first man who could sword fight and quote Virgil. So, she played the long game. Publicly, she kept everyone guessing. Privately, she rejected everyone. She flirted with the idea of marriage the way some people flirt with buying a treadmill. She talked about it a lot and never followed through. And so she crafted one of the most brilliant political identities in history, the Virgin Queen. Not because she was celibate, historians still debate that, but because it gave her the perfect excuse to stay single while projecting holiness, strength, and national unity. She married England. She said the country was her spouse, which is a very poetic way of saying, I'm too busy for a man. And frankly, none of them are worth the paperwork. Foreign rulers kept trying. Suitors sent portraits, gifts, and armies, occasionally in the wrong order. Elizabeth accepted their flattery, danced with ambassadors, and then reminded everyone that she still had no ring on her finger and no intention of dying in childbirth. Like half her ancestors, by refusing to marry, she kept every court in Europe on edge. No one could predict who she'd ally with next, or if she'd ally at all. It wasn't just political independence, it was a masterclass in power hoarding, and she made it look effortless. Once Elizabeth secured the throne and politely batted away every marriage offer like flies at a summer feast, she turned her attention to managing her court, a glittering nest of vipers in lace collars. Her council was a mix of loyalists, opportunists, and deeply confused men who hadn't entirely adjusted to taking orders from someone without a beard. But Elizabeth had one distinct advantage. She'd spent her entire life watching powerful people make mistakes. Now she made sure she didn't. Running court politics under Elizabeth was like playing chess blindfolded on a moving ship during a thunderstorm, except the Queen could see the whole board and occasionally whispered checkmate just to watch everyone sweat. Her favourite tactic is keeping everyone guessing. She granted titles slowly, rewards rarely, and trust never. If a courtier got too confident, she reminded them gently or witheringly that proximity to the throne was not a retirement plan. One moment you were her sweet Robin, and the next you were being sent to Ireland with a polite letter and zero military funding. Even her closest advisor, William Cassell, spent decades deciphering what she really meant when she said, perhaps. Spoiler, it meant no. But she never said it directly because saying no closed doors. Elizabeth preferred to leave them slightly ajar, just enough to let people trip over their own ambition. She also had a flair for theatrical delay. Decisions took weeks, sometimes months, not because she was indecisive, but because every minute of uncertainty made her court more dependent on her. Nothing happened without her signature, and her signature was in no rush. Flattery was currency at her court, but you had to be careful. One compliment too far and she'd roast you publicly. One step too close and you might be promoted or banished. No one ever knew what she was truly thinking, which is exactly how she liked it. Elizabeth didn't just sit on the throne, she performed on the throne, eyes always watching, smile always calculated, and power always in reach, but never fully shared. Her court didn't govern her, it revolved around her. Elizabeth I didn't just rule England, she dressed the part so aggressively that her wardrobe deserves its own diplomatic corps. The average noblewoman wore velvet and pearls to show status. Elizabeth wore velvet and pearls to declare war on your expectations. Her gowns weren't clothes. They were political armour, stitched with intent and a hint of try me. Every outfit she wore was a calculated power play. Massive ruffs, elaborate embroidery, and enough jewels to bankrupt a duke, all carefully arranged to scream one very specific message. I am the state, and I am not here for your nonsense. She turned her face into a canvas of myth. White lead makeup gave her a ghostly, almost divine appearance. Her wigs, towering, curled, and occasionally weaponizable, reinforced the image of eternal youth and unwavering strength. Never mind the lead poisoning. Looking immortal was worth the migraines. Elizabeth used fashion as a psychological weapon. When she wore white, it wasn't innocence, it was invincibility. When she wore black, it wasn't mourning, it was a menace. Her colours, fabrics and jewels were selected not for beauty but for effect. She walked into every room like she owned not just the palace but the air inside it. And here's the fun part. No one else was allowed to copy her look, literally. She passed sumptuary laws against wearing certain fabrics or colours. The message was clear. You may dress up, but you will never dress like me. Even portraits were tightly controlled. You couldn't just paint the Queen mid-blink or mid-frown. She had an official mask of youth, a face template painters were required to follow, so that she always looked like she hadn't aged a day since 1563. Photoshop Elizabethan edition. But beneath the silks and sequins was cold calculation. Elizabeth understood that image is power. If she looked invincible, people would think twice before challenging her. If she looked otherworldly, people might just forget she was technically a mortal woman navigating a very real, very male world. Elizabeth thus didn't just rule a kingdom. She micromanaged it like a CEO with trust issues and a suspicious amount of free time. While most monarchs delegated tasks like foreign policy, religious reform, and not plunging the realm into bankruptcy, Elizabeth preferred the hands-on approach. Letters passed through her hands. Speeches were edited personally. Military campaigns she weighed in on. Portraits approved or destroyed. Even the font size of official proclamations probably had to pass the "does this make me look weak?" test. Her council, led by William Cecil, her long-suffering chief advisor, often found themselves in a never-ending loop of submitting ideas, having them returned with 20 notes in the margins, and then being asked why it hadn't been done yesterday. Working under Elizabeth meant surviving a constant state of polite panic. She wasn't cruel, just relentless. Courtiers dreaded her glares. Ambassadors sweated through every sentence. Even Parliament treaded carefully. She once refused to give them an answer on marriage for 25 years. That's not a queen. That's a woman who turned ghosting into domestic policy. And let's talk correspondence. Elizabeth loved letters. She read them, revised them, and sometimes rewrote them entirely. If a diplomat sent something too weak, she'd tear it up. Too bold, she'd tear them up. She understood the power of words, and she made sure hers hit harder than a cavalry charge. She also ran a tight information ship. Intelligence gathering under Elizabeth was no joke. Francis Walsingham, her spy master, created a proto-MI6 that sniffed out threats, intercepted letters, and cracked codes with terrifying efficiency. If you were plotting something against her, chances are she already had your letter open, underlined in red, and ready for dramatic reading at council. All this control served a purpose. Elizabeth didn't trust her nobles, her foreign allies, or frankly most of humanity. She'd seen what happened when power slipped, and she never planned to let go of hers. The result was a queen who didn't just sit on the throne. She ran the entire operation like a one-woman HR department, war office, branding agency, and crisis hotline. And if anyone complained, they were free to try ruling the kingdom themselves, for about 5 seconds. In 1588, Spain made a terrible mistake. They assumed England would be an easy target. To be fair, the math checked out. Spain had the largest navy in the world, more gold than sense, and a king, Philip II, who thought God was personally rooting for him. England, on the other hand, had fewer ships, less money, and a queen who still hadn't picked a husband or an heir. The whole country looked like it was held together with parchment and Protestant guilt. But Elizabeth I didn't panic. She suited up, literally. As the Spanish Armada approached, Elizabeth marched to Tilbury, where her troops were camped, and gave one of the most metal speeches in royal history. She wore a white velvet dress with a breastplate over it, because if you're going to inspire soldiers, you may as well do it while looking like a war goddess who moonlights as a wedding cake. She told her army, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Translation: Yes, I'm small, unmarried and female, but I will absolutely wreck you if you touch my coat. It worked. Morale soared. The speech echoed across the camp. And while Elizabeth wasn't actually leading the ships into battle, she was bold, not insane. Her presence made it clear England had no intention of rolling over. Then, in a twist of fate and meteorology, everything fell apart for Spain. The Armada, once invincible, was pummeled by smaller, faster English ships, set ablaze by fire ships, and finally scattered by a lovely bit of Protestant-friendly weather. Some Spanish sailors ended up drowning, others limped home, cold, hungry, and very much not victorious. Elizabeth didn't let the moment go to waste. She turned the defeat of the Armada into a full-on branding campaign. Medals were struck, and paintings were commissioned. God clearly was English now. It was more than a military victory. It was a narrative victory. Elizabeth, the unmarried queen everyone underestimated, had faced down the most powerful empire in Europe and sent it home soggy and humiliated. Never underestimate a woman in pearls and armour. If there's one thing monarchs are supposed to do besides avoid being overthrown, it's produce an heir, preferably one who isn't a scandal in trousers. But Elizabeth I, ever the innovator, decided to skip that part entirely. From the moment she took the throne, people asked the same question. So, who's next? Her answer for 44 years was essentially, "You'll find out when I do." She never married, never had children, and most scandalously never officially named a successor, which, for the record, is kind of like owning a bus company and refusing to hire a driver for tomorrow. Was this irresponsible? Maybe strategic? Absolutely. By keeping the succession vague, Elizabeth avoided empowering potential rivals. Naming an heir in advance would have been like handing someone a crown-shaped invitation to start plotting her funeral. And after spending time in the Tower for allegedly being on the wrong side of succession drama, Elizabeth had zero interest in starring in that sequel, so she kept everyone guessing. Would it be Mary, Queen of Scots? Spoiler, no. She got her head removed after years of plotting and letter passing. Would it be James of Scotland? Maybe, but no promises, not yet. Foreign diplomats wrote endless reports speculating about her intentions. Her own advisers gently and not so gently urged her to make it clear. Elizabeth, with the grace of a cat knocking things off a table, refused. She once snapped at Parliament, saying they had no business asking about her successor unless they planned to kill her. Touché, Majesty. But behind the scenes, she likely had James of Scotland in mind. She just didn't say it out loud, because saying it made it real, and making it real meant giving someone else the spotlight. And Elizabeth wasn't about to dim hers for anyone. While Elizabeth I was busy outwitting assassins, dodging marriage proposals, and refusing to name an heir, she also accidentally ushered in one of the greatest cultural booms in English history. Welcome to the Elizabethan and Golden Age, also known as the time when England suddenly got really good at poetry, drama, and being extremely dramatic about everything. Let's start with the obvious. William Shakespeare. The Bard of Avon wrote most of his iconic plays under Elizabeth's reign. You know, Macbeth, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, all those cheerful little tales about murder, ghosts, and teenage romance gone horribly wrong. Elizabeth loved the theatre, and frequently patronised acting companies, even when some of her advisers grumbled that stage plays were corrupting the youth with too many double entendres and not enough scripture. But Elizabeth saw the value in art, not just as entertainment, but as soft power. Theatre was the Netflix of the 16th century. If people were watching a play, they weren't rioting, and if the play ended with a strong, clever monarch triumphing over chaos, even better, she didn't just inspire playwrights. Poets worshipped her in verse. Petratists immortalized her as an ageless goddess. Explorers named entire colonies after her. England under Elizabeth suddenly believed it was the centre of the universe, and Elizabeth was very much okay with that. Even science and navigation got a glow up. While she wasn't launching ships herself, she supported the men who did. People like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, who returned from voyages with maps, loot, and more than a few new enemies. These expeditions weren't always ethical or legal, but they helped fuel England's growing sense of ambition and piracy. Culturally, England went from a rainy island to an intellectual hotspot. And Elizabeth didn't just sit back and let it happen. She curated her image, controlled the message, and surrounded herself with people who made her reign look not only powerful but also inspired. She was a living myth, a ruler who weaponized wit and aesthetics as effectively as swords. Under her rule, England didn't just survive, it performed. Elizabeth I had no husband, no children, and no tolerance for emotional liabilities and breaches. But that didn't mean her court was free of romantic drama. Far from it. If anything, it was like watching The Bachelor, except the stakes were national stability, and the lead had absolute power. Enter Robert Dudley. Dudley was tall, handsome, ambitious, and alarmingly close to the Queen, emotionally, politically, and sometimes physically, depending on who was gossiping that week. Their relationship fueled endless speculation. Were they in love? Were they lovers? Was it all one long Elizabeth and flirt designed to make Europe lose its mind? Elizabeth never gave a clear answer, and that was the point. She paraded Dudley through court in fancy titles and generous land grants. She kept him near, but never too near. When rumours of an affair got out of hand, she denied everything with regal grace, and just enough sass to keep everyone guessing. Even when Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances, possibly having fallen downstairs, possibly pushed by history itself, Elizabeth did not distance herself. She just didn't marry him either. Smart move. A marriage to Dudley would have been political suicide. He was noble, but not royal. Scandal clung to him like lace on a doublet, and the mere idea of the Queen choosing love over diplomacy made foreign ambassadors break out in medieval hives. But Elizabeth didn't just manage Dudley. She weaponized courtly love. She entertained suitors from France, Austria, and Sweden, smiling sweetly, accepting portraits, and then nothing. She turned negotiation into an art form, delaying decisions until the political winds changed, or the suitor got bored and married someone less exhausting. By remaining single and available, Elizabeth played every side. If Spain needed placating, she flirted with a Habsburg. If France needed distracting, she promised to consider a Valois. If England needed reassurance, she reminded them that she already married the realm. Very poetic, very convenient. Her love life wasn't a soap opera. It was a performance, a slow, deliberate dance designed to keep enemies confused, allies hopeful, and everyone too busy speculating to notice how completely in control she was. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth I was no longer the bright-eyed redhead, dazzling suitors and terrifying ambassadors. She was now in her 60s, a remarkable feat in a century when most people considered 40 to be pushing it. Her hair was wigs, her teeth were mostly theoretical, and her temper was legendary. But make no mistake, She was still the queen and very much in charge. Old age didn't mellow Elizabeth, it sharpened her. Courtiers walked on eggshells, ambassadors developed spontaneous nosebleeds rather than deliver bad news. She was known to throw things during council meetings, gloves, shoes, and devastating insults, depending on her mood and how brave you were. Her inner circle thinned. Many of her closest allies had died or retired, and replacements never quite measured up. She grew increasingly suspicious, increasingly isolated, and increasingly fond of reminding everyone who actually ran the kingdom. She also got more theatrical. Her gowns became heavier, her makeup was thicker, her persona more myth than monarch. She was no longer trying to be relatable. She was a living relic, England's Gloriana, mother of the nation, and quite possibly immortal. And yet, despite the decay and the drama, she never stopped ruling. She still read every report, signed every letter, and made every major decision. Sometimes after weeks of stalling just to keep everyone sweating. Even when her health declined, she refused to lie down, quite literally. Toward the end of her life, she spent days on her feet, afraid that if she lay down, she'd never rise again. Spoiler, she was right. But here's what makes it all so impressive. Elizabeth could have coasted into her final years with comfort and flattery. She could have handed power to younger advisors, named a successor, or maybe even written a memoir. Instead, she held the reins until her fingers couldn't grip them and still refused to let go. She didn't fade quietly. She aged loudly like a royal hurricane with pearls and eyeliner, fragile in body maybe, but never in will. Her courtiers may have feared her, but the country watched, waited, and whispered the same thing for years. She may be old, but God help us when she's gone. By the year 6003, Elizabeth I had ruled England for over 4 decades. She had outlived all her suitors, nearly all her counsellors, most of her enemies, and frankly, anyone who thought she wouldn't last. But even for a queen as relentlessly composed as Elizabeth, the curtain eventually had to fall. She just refused to sit down for it. In her final days, Elizabeth fell into a decline physically and emotionally. Her health was failing. The court was whispering. She barely spoke. And when she did, it was often cryptic, mumbled, or laced with tutorat melancholy. But the most telling moment was when she wouldn't go to bed. She literally refused to lie down for days. She stood or sat in a chair, dressed, alert and determined. Servants pleaded, physicians begged. Her ladies-in-waiting wept. But Elizabeth, queen of self-control and icon of public image, believed that if she lay down, death would take her. Spoiler. It did anyway, but only after she made it wait. Eventually her exhaustion overcame even her famously stubborn will, and she was carried to her bed at Richmond Palace. There, surrounded by flickering candles, anxious courtiers, and the dying embers of a truly ridiculous reign, Elizabeth I finally passed. No grand death speech, no royal decree carved in stone, just the quiet end of a woman who had ruled alone, ruled fiercely, and never let anyone see her vulnerable, not even at the end. And yet, even as she faded, she managed one final political manoeuvre. Though she had refused for years to name a successor when pressed one last time, she reportedly gestured toward James of Scotland. Not exactly a dramatic endorsement, but in Elizabethan politics, a subtle nod might as well have been fireworks and a press release. And so, with that quiet motion, the Tudor dynasty ended, and the Stuart line began. But Elizabeth didn't go out like a fallen monarch. She went out like a statue, finally stepping off its pedestal. She died as she lived, alone, unbent, and entirely on her own terms. Because for Elizabeth, surrender, even to something as inevitable as death, was never really part of the plan. Elizabeth didn't just leave behind a throne. She left behind a blueprint for how to be unforgettable. She had no husband, no heir, and no dynasty to extend her bloodline. What she had was an idea that a woman could rule not just competently but brilliantly, that she could dominate politics, diplomacy, fashion, culture, and war, all while being underestimated by literally everyone who met her. Her reign lasted 44 years. In that time, she transformed England from a chaotic, debt-ridden, religiously divided mess into a confident, culturally explosive, internationally feared power. All this while ducking assassinations, religious wars, and centuries of patriarchal expectations that screamed, "Please marry a man and behave." She refused and thrived. Her legacy isn't just the Elizabethan and Golden Ages or the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It's the image she cultivated and controlled so precisely that it lasted for centuries. She became a living myth. Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Astrea, half goddess, half monarch, fully in charge. Even after death, she controlled the narrative. Her portraits were mass-produced, her speeches were quoted like scripture, and her carefully edited persona became the national symbol of an entire era. And while later historians would try to pick her apart, her temper, her indecision, her vanity, none could deny the scope of what she accomplished alone in a world built to deny her everything. She wasn't perfect. She could be manipulative, ruthless, and emotionally distant. She clung to power long past her prime, alienated allies, and kept the country in suspense for decades. But those flaws, they were part of the machinery. The myth didn't work without the woman behind it grinding the gears. And let's not forget, she did it all without a king, without an heir, and without ever backing down. So, what is Elizabeth's true legacy? It's not just a time period named after her. It's not just Shakespeare, sea captains, or glorious portraits with enough pearls to sink a small boat. It's this. She rewrote the rules and dared everyone else to catch up. And centuries later, we're still talking about her, still debating her, still impressed because queens come and go. But there was only one Elizabeth I, out of the endless wind-scoured grasslands of Mongolia, where yurts dotted the horizon and horses outnumbered people, something strange began to rise. A city. Not just any city, a capital. And not just any capital. The centre of the largest land empire in human history. You'd think Genghis Khan, founder of this empire, would have had no time for palaces. After all, his whole life was one long camping trip powered by conquest. Why settle down when your idea of fun was galloping into China, Persia, or Russia and taking whatever you wanted? But even conquerors get mail. Even world-ruling warlords need a place to store the loot. And so somewhere between world domination and dinner, Genghis Khan picked a spot in the Oron Valley. It was sacred land, once home to ancient Turk and Uyghur capitals, and it had everything a Mongol needed. Open pastures, flowing rivers, and space to build something worthy of an empire. Now, let's be clear. Genghis didn't build much. He was a man of motion, not masonry. But he did mark the place. A few foundations, a temple here, a market there, enough to plant the seed. And when his son Ogedei inherited the throne, that seed exploded into something no one saw coming. Ogedei Khan, practical yet ambitious, turned that humble beginning into a full-fledged city, Karakoram. It had walls, it had roads, it even had plumbing, Mongol plumbing, and more shockingly, it had foreign artisans, captured engineers, Muslim architects, Chinese bureaucrats, and a tent palace with silver fountains that squirted fermented mare's milk at the push of a button. Civilized, right? But Karakorum wasn't about extravagance. It was a power move, a message. We may sleep in felt tents, but we rule the world. Here, emissaries from Baghdad and Paris bowed in the same palace. Here, silk met steel, camels met crusaders, and the steppe met the city. The Mongols, once thought too wild to build, were now city planners. And Karakorum wasn't just a capital, it was a contradiction in brick and bone. A place that shouldn't exist but did right in the heart of the wild. If Genghis Khan was the fire that consumed the world, Ogada Khan was the one who sat down afterward and asked, "All right, now what do we do with all this?" Inheriting a supersized empire that stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, Ögedei had the difficult task of civilizing the chaos. His answer, Karakorum. Ögedei didn't just want a base of operations, he wanted a stage. A world capital that would prove the Mongols weren't just horseback thugs with better aim. No, they were rulers, builders, and organizers, and in classic Mongol fashion, he made it happen fast. First, the layout. Karakorum wasn't random. It was designed with military precision. Square walls, 4 gates pointing to the cardinal directions, and an inner city that housed the Khan's court. At the centre stood the palace of Ögedei, a fusion of tent and temple adorned with gold tiles and painted beams. It looked like a yurt had married a Chinese pagoda, and it worked. Then came the weird part. Ögedei's Karakorum became a cultural smoothie. Here was a Christian church, there a Buddhist stupa. A few steps away, a mosque rang out the call to prayer, right next to a Confucian temple, where scribes copied edicts in 5 different scripts all under one roof, or rather, one sky. Why? Because the Mongols weren't just conquerors. They were collectors of people, ideas, and technologies. Ögedei welcomed envoys, artisans, and scholars from every corner of the empire. He kidnapped the best talent and called it hiring. Persian metalworkers forged coins. Chinese engineers made siege engines. Russian craftsmen carved ivory. Karakorum was less a Mongol city and more a Eurasian laboratory. And at the heart of it all stood a silver tree. Literally. Ögedei commissioned a Franco-Parisian blacksmith to craft a mechanical silver tree with pipes running up the trunk, each one dispensing a different liquor: Irag, mead, wine, and rice beer. 4 lion heads gushed the drinks. It was part force, part art installation, and part royal flex. To the foreign ambassadors arriving from Constantinople or Delhi, Karakorum was confusing. Was this the capital of a barbarian horde or a cosmopolitan empire? The answer was yes. Ögedei had created not just a city but a Mongol mirror, a place that reflected everything they had taken, twisted it into something new, and made it pour booze from a silver tree. It's easy to imagine Karakorum as a Mongol Las Vegas full of yurts, horses, and wild parties under the stars, but by the mid-13th century it had become something else entirely, a global diplomatic nerve centre. And the strangest part is it actually worked. You see, most capitals kept foreign visitors at arm's length, but the Mongols, they practically begged you to come over for dinner, for tribute, for interrogation. Karakorum became a revolving door of emissaries, missionaries, merchants, spies, and political dreamers. It was the kind of place where a Persian envoy could chat with a Russian fur trader and a Franciscan friar while waiting for an audience with the great Khan over cups of fermented mare's milk. Papal legates from Rome showed up hoping to convert Mongols to Christianity. Instead, they got a tour of the silver liquor and a polite no thanks. Envoys from the Abbasid Caliphate brought gifts and religious texts, only to be met by Mongols more interested in their engineering blueprints than their theology. The Mongols didn't discriminate, they just took what they liked and sent the rest home. Diplomacy in Karakoram was brisk, multilingual, and refreshingly blunt. No flowery court rituals here, no stiff robes and powdered wigs. Visitors were expected to bow low, offer gifts, and not whine too much about the smell. In return, they might get gold, horses, or a letter from the Khan promising peace or war depending on his mood. The Mongol postal system made this all possible. Imagine express mail powered by horses and yurts, a vast relay network of mounted couriers stretching across Asia. Messages could travel faster from Beijing to Karakoram than a medieval French king could get from Paris to Lyon. It gave the Mongol court near-instant intelligence and a steady stream of foreign visitors. And yes, Karakoram scribes recorded everything. The city's administration was a bureaucratic Frankenstein. Scribes fluent in Uyghur, Chinese, Persian and Syriac all sat in the same room writing the same decree in 4 different scripts. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Karakoram wasn't just a city of tents and temples.